Welcome to Coke and Conversation, and today we are sharing a Coke and Conversation with Jason Vaughn from Frisch's. Jason, did you spend your misspent youth sitting around, I guess back then we called them soda fountains, having a Coke?
I did. I was raised in Knoxville, Tennessee, and so I was familiar with the big boy concept. It was Shoney's big boy back then. And so whenever I would get good grades, whenever I would do good in sports, my dad would take me and I would either get a hot fudge cake or a Coca-Cola. So it's always had this emotional connection for me with the big boy brand as I was growing up. So we would always sit at a counter. That was the thing I always thought was unique whenever community tables became a big thing in restaurants the last 5 or 7 years. That's the really cool thing about Frisch's. The counters that are still in our restaurants were the community tables, they just weren't called that. So it was always the community table, and it still works today. You can walk into our restaurants and you see these gentlemen or these women that have known each other for 5, 10, 15 years. They meet there every morning or for every lunch, and they have the conversations about what's going on in the world. So I remember that growing up, sitting at those soda fountains and having those conversations and watching the grown-ups talk and meeting with my father there. So it was really cool.
Before we start talking about Frisch's and the brand and the emotional connection, like you mentioned, to this brand, what led you here? Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got here to Frisch's.
Yeah, I started in the restaurant industry around 30 years ago with Yum Brands. And so David Novak is a dynamic leader for the folks that have never had anything or read or heard anything about David Novak, but he was a culture-driven leader, and the metrics and the numbers had to be there, and it was really around how you drive this culture of accountability and this culture of recognition. And so my restaurant industry was, I think, non-traditional in the sense that we served food, but it was about growing and developing our people and ourselves to become better, stronger leaders. And so over those 30 years, I always wanted to do more, right? How do you take something that's maybe got a little bit of rust on it, and how do you knock that rust off and make it shiny again? And through my career, I'd worked for big brands and traveled a lot, and it was a lot of great experiences, and those companies provided me things for my family that I'll always be grateful for. But I knew in my heart I wanted to get to a smaller brand that had this great legacy, but again had a little bit of rust on it, to say if you could go in and just tweak it a little bit, evolve it, not revolutionize it, but just evolve it some, could you bring it back to what it used to be? And that's fits, Frisch's fits that mold perfectly, right? That you have this great legacy, this great heritage. People love the brand wherever it's at, but maybe not in their mindset with as many new restaurants that open up now. Maybe it's not the first in their decision set. So how do you put us as Frisch's back in their mind as, hey, let's go there first and think about that. So that's the work that I wanted to do and was fortunate enough to have this post.
Those of us who grew up in this area, we knew about Frisch's. Like you talked about in the South, it's Shoney's. Here it's Frisch's Big Boy. When you took this job over and you started talking to people who worked here as kids decades ago, who grew up here, who grew up coming here, tell us a little bit about a couple of the stories that you heard that maybe kind of blew you away, that the emotional connection that Frisch's has in this area.
Yeah, it was a couple of things, Betsy. First of all, when you tell someone where you work, they smile at you. So that's the first indicator that something good happened there, right? So they start to smile, and they tell you about, well, I would always meet my grandparents, my family would always meet my grandparents there, and we would have Sunday breakfast. It was, I met my wife there, I bet you, or husband, I'll bet you no fewer than 10 times in my 2.5 years there. I've heard that story 10 times. I met my wife there, my future wife, my future husband. It was whenever we had, kids, we would take them to Frisch's for the first time. It was my high school buddies, right? It was all these emotional things that no other brand that I've ever worked for or heard about has that same emotional pull to it. And so whenever I was doing my due diligence, that was really striking to me. So I knew coming in, it didn't create any hesitation to take the role, but what it did make me do was say, you have to do your homework. You have to understand the brand that you're coming into, and you can take and overlay this playbook that you use at other brands and it just won't work here. You really have to be in tune to what it means to these communities, because as you know, in Cincinnati we have a lot of little different communities, and each restaurant means something a little bit different inside those communities. And so, for example, once a quarter I have lunch with Dave Frisch's granddaughters. And so I would ask, tell me about Dave, tell me what kind of man he was, what was his vision for Frisch's, why did he do the things he did? And so I wanted to be able to pull that through in a very recognizable way to our Frisch's users that have been around for 30, 40 years, but also bring in a new customer as well. And so that was very important to me to understand, not only talking to his family, but also our people that have retired from us 30 and 40 years ago. What was the company like then? What did it stand for? And what were those things that helped that culture build such a unique family atmosphere in a large company? Most people, when they think of Frisch's, they think of a small company, and for the most part, we are at 123 restaurants, but there's over 6,000 team members in the Frisch's system that work for us, and that's not a small company. And out of those 6,000, several hundred of those folks, worked with us for 20, 30, and 40 years. And in this restaurant, we're at the Mainliner today, right, which has a great historical presence in the city of Cincinnati. Miss Eva, who's one of our servers, has literally worked in this restaurant for 51 years. And so you don't find that in many other industries, much less the restaurant industry. So it was really cool to find that as I came on board here.
So talking to people as you came on board and listening to what Frisch's meant to them, one thing that Frisch's meant to them was Coca-Cola.
That's right.
And so that was something that I think you had a priority very early on.
Yeah, it was one of the tenets we talked about when we came in was listen to our guests first. And it was overwhelmingly the number one thing they wanted us to do was bring back Coke. So that was, we had to walk a tight wire between, Pepsi being a terrific brand, it just wasn't right for Frisch's. And so how do you get the customer what it needs and wants for them to feel like this is that heritage that's part of that loyalty? And so we went to work in a very diligent way, but also in a very respectable way to say, how do we get a win-win out of this? It's keep everybody whole from a business end of this, but also make sure that the guests and customers get what they want, and that's their cherry and vanilla Coke with the big boy.
And since then, what's been the reaction?
It's been overwhelmingly, just incredibly, over the top positive. From social media, we had over 11 million social impressions on our social platform. And for major companies, if they get 3 to 5 million, they feel like they've had a good day. So again, for the size of our company to get over 11 million, we were just over the moon about it. But just everywhere we go, the customers are thanking us. And what caught me off guard was the people that work for us thanked us. They really felt like Frisch's is now back to whole. And it was really great for our culture internally. We know that our guests appreciate it, and that was probably the most surprising thing out of all this is what it meant to our team to be able to serve Coca-Cola again.
Frisch's is one of these brands, as we talked about, that really is a legacy brand in so many communities, not just Cincinnati. But you want to keep that legacy, but just like every other company, you have to move forward. You have to add things. You have to, get into the 21st century. First of all, how do you walk that tightrope? And second of all, what is ahead for Frisch's in the near future?
Yeah, it's threading the needle is challenging, right? So the first thing we needed to do was upgrade our IT infrastructure. Some of the systems that were being used were used several decades ago. We also knew that as we brought in technology, that was going to force our workforce to change, that our workforce wasn't necessarily tech savvy. So we had to run parallel paths between bringing in technology, our social platforms, and bringing our team along with it. And so there were some challenges to that. When people are used to a certain way of doing things for 20 or 30 years, how do you balance that? So you have to make sure you're moving at the right speed, but moving with purpose and moving it forward. And so every facet of the business, whether it was our menu architecture, the buildings that you're sitting in, even our advertising, all had to shift and change, but it had to be recognized by our guests that, yep, that's the Frisch's I know, and our team as well to go, yeah, that's the company I recognize and still want to work for. So it was a migration versus a revolution, but make no mistake that we've continued down that path and haven't stopped, and we don't continue to stop. And so what's next for us is really about that guest engagement. How do we start engaging with our guests differently that Frisch's hasn't before? It'll be through our mobile app, which will launch in November. That'll also be tied directly to delivery. We'll do home delivery service, so we're excited about that. And how we engage with them on social media through different platforms on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. So we know that's the vehicle of communication, and then we want to keep progressing past that, right? That's kind of what everybody else is doing. And so how do we bring technology into the restaurant so when someone does come and visit us, that they have the type of interaction and engagement they want with our team, as well as how they want to interact on their mobile devices as well.
So when you sit down at the lunch counter and you have a Coke and you have a choice, who would you like to have a Coke and conversation with? Anybody?
Anybody, you know what? I've got a weird answer for you. Here it is. I just learned a couple of weeks ago that I'm going to be a grandfather for the first time, so I'm going to hold my answer to say I can't wait to have my first Coke with my grandchild whenever they're of age. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
Jason Vaughn, thank you so much for having a Coke and conversation with us.
No, thank you, Betsy.